Hi everyone, this is video 2.5 looking at some examples of love and faithfulness. So the readings that you just completed identified an effective discipler as someone who is loving and faithful. And before you continue reading about some of the other qualities of a discipler, I want to take a few minutes to provide some tangible examples of what a loving and faithful discipler looks like. And as I share a couple examples from my life, I want you to be thinking about the people in your life that you think exemplify these qualities well. So, an effective discipler is loving. Whenever I think of love, my mind immediately goes to two people. The first is Mary Grace, who was a neighbor and one of the first people that we met when we first moved to Seattle. And the second is our daughter, Jade. Mary Grace is a photographer, and one of her habits is to capture images of hearts showing up in unusual ways. So it may be in a leaf, or clouds, or garbage on the sidewalk, or seaweed washed ashore in the shape of a heart. She's trained her eyes to see these heart images in everyday items, and she'll capture them with her camera in order to share those images. And when we first moved in next to Mary Grace, we also met her husband, Stephen. We tried to connect with them, but like a lot of Seattleites, they kept to themselves. So we didn't see them very much other than just some waves and quick hellos for that first year. And after about a year, she felt a little more comfortable with us, comfortable enough to share that her husband had left and they were getting a divorce. She continued to keep mostly to herself, but she started seeing a lot more of our kids who were always out playing in the yard. And our kids learned that she looked for hearts, so they were always on the lookout for rocks shaped like hearts. And when they found some, they would go leave them on Mary Grace's doorstep for her to find. And in particular, our second daughter, Jade, who was about 4 at the time, just poured love onto Mary Grace. Jesus' words are so true when he pointed to children saying, we need to learn from them and become like them. Jade has always had a supernatural capacity to love, to see you as special for no reason at all other than for being you. Though I'd love to take credit for it, I don't think she got this from me or from Jared. It's truly a gift from God. And God used this unrestricted and unfiltered love of a 4-year-old to disciple and mend the broken heart of our 45-year-old neighbor. Every time Jade saw Mary Grace, which was usually every day, her face lit up with the same excitement as if it had been a month or a year since she'd seen her. And in a season when Mary Grace felt very unloved and unwanted, Jade showed her every day how special she was simply by yelling, "Mary Grace!" and running to give her a hug whenever she saw her. And our children collecting heart-shaped rocks showed her that people thought of her even when they weren't with her. Jade sat with Mary Grace, chatted with her, hugged her, had time for her, not out of obligation, but out of love. And we didn't understand at the time the impact of that year and that it had on Mary Grace until much later. She carried baggage from her childhood experience as a preacher's daughter, which made her resistant to any of our invitations to church or anything to do with church. But she did begin to trust us with her relationship and her story, and we became really good friends. And about 2 years in, we did an Alpha course, which is an evangelistic event that provides space for unbelievers to ask questions about God. And Mary Grace showed a little bit of interest, but wasn't able to attend the first few weeks. So I continued to invite her each week. Each week went by without her being there. And finally, by the last week, I was getting ready to text her and was just thinking, man, she's got to be so annoyed at my texts every single week. Inviting. And I don't know that I need to keep bugging her. She hasn't come yet. I don't know that she wants to. But I ended up going ahead, sending her a text with the information for that last meeting, just letting her know we'd love to have her. She didn't end up going that week either. But her response to my text really surprised me. She said, "Thank you so much for your text. I actually sent your text to my dad just telling him how amazing it was to have such great neighbors who let me know how loved I am. And I honestly started panicking a little bit, thinking, I don't think I sent her a meaningful text. Like, what is she talking about? And so I even pulled up the last text I sent her to see had I written something meaningful. I just didn't remember it. But no, I read the text, and it was literally, hey, the last alpha is this week. Here's what time it is. Here's where it is. We'd love to have you. Basic information of the alpha. And I was so struck by how differently she and I saw my texts. I saw them as maybe becoming annoying or too persistent, and she saw them as being wanted. And that's the love that first Jade and later we were able to show Mary Grace, being seen as special for no particular reason and being wanted. We're great friends with Mary Grace. She has regularly told us how Jade is the only reason that she got through that first year after her divorce. She's been able to work through a lot of her childhood scars and now goes to church with her parents. And she has become one of the adults that my daughters, Sydney and now 10-year-old Jade, look up to as their mentor. So that's our example of love in action, being wanted. So moving on to faithfulness. Faithfulness is similar to love in that its meaning is so big that it's actually kind of becomes vague. So it can be hard to pinpoint what tangible love and faithfulness is. For me, faith is exemplified in the life of my former youth minister, Kevin. When I was in high school, we thought Kevin would be one of those rare lifelong youth ministers. But after my senior year, he transitioned out of 3 decades of youth ministry in order to plant a church. He and his wife, Brenda, along with their son and daughter-in-law, Ryan and Jessica, planted Renovatus in Vancouver, Washington, with the mission lives being restored to their original purpose and intended beauty. Renovatus was the first church plant Jared and I apprenticed at before we even knew we'd be starting a church someday. And about the time that we left Renovatus in order to go to grad school, Renovatus was ready to send out Ryan and Jessica to plant a second church in a different part of Vancouver. And also about that same time was when they discovered cancer in Ryan's spine. For the next, I think it was maybe 18 months or so, Ryan and Jess continued their work to build a faith community. And that work culminated not in the launch of a church meeting every week, but in the gathering of hundreds of people at Ryan's funeral to honor his faithfulness and using his journey to bring out faith in others. Renovatus and Kevin and Brenda continued that faithfulness. Kevin will tell you that there were many Sundays for the next year or so that he showed up and said, I just don't have anything for you today. And as a community, they spent those times asking hard questions of faith together, hugging each other, filling in for one another, worshiping together, and grieving together. That year or two of intense grief became a part of their faith story as a community. And this story is significant to us because it's one of the many stories that has really helped Jared and I reshape our understanding of faith. I think for most of our lives, we'd always heard in sermons and teachings that the opposite of faith is doubt, which naturally then leads to assumptions like if you have doubts, then you don't have faith or your faith is weak. And I wholeheartedly disagree with this. Doubt is not the opposite of faith. And I actually think it's a significant component of faith. We see this in Scripture. Jesus says, if you have faith as small as a mustard seed, which implies that there's some doubt. In Mark 9, the Father asks Jesus to heal his son and says, I believe, help my unbelief. The opposite of faith isn't doubt. If you have no doubts, then there's no need for faith. If you're sure of something, it's not faith you're holding that's holding you to that belief. It's just reality. No, the opposite of faith isn't doubt. The opposite of faith is self-reliance. If you can rely on yourself, you don't have to have faith in anything else. Healing doesn't require faith if you have the cure. Provision doesn't require faith if you have resources. And despite 30 years of ministry experience, several years of church planter training, and multiple occasions of walking other people through grief, Kevin could not rely on his experience or recycling old sermons or anything in his past. But in faith, Kevin and Brenda persistently, they just showed up with nothing to give, not knowing what would happen. And they showed up with a lot of questions that they had never asked before. And their community, many of whom they brought to faith, in turn helped them wrestle with their questions of faith. And today, Renovatus is a thriving community of faith that continues to be a space where doubts are welcome. So there's obviously so many examples of different ways love and faithfulness can express themselves. These are just a couple examples of how we've seen them in ways that have been helpful to us, but I hope hearing them just helps get the gears rolling in your minds as you begin to think about some of the people that display these key discipling characteristics in your life. And the more tangible we can make these really big ideas, the easier it will be to learn how to nurture these characteristics in your own life so that they can hopefully become a natural part of your discipling relationships.